Let me just briefly introduce our new colleagues on stage here. So starting on the far side, and I'll let them each talk a little bit about their companies when they kind of start answering my initial softball questions that I hope I'll make harder as time goes on. Starting on the far, your right, of Philipp Pieper of Proximic. Next to him is Magid Abraham of ComScore. Todd Levy of Bitly, and Dave Morgan of Simulmedia. And Dave, many of you know, has been a long-time internet data guy. Actually, all these people have been doing it for a while, except probably you. You're the youngest by far. When did you start Bitly, by the way? How long ago?
July 2008.
That's not very long ago, considering we all use it like every day. It's kind of amazing, really. Let me just start with asking you, Dave Morgan, since you are I think of you as sort of a veteran of the internet data arena, and the battles around it. Talk a little bit, just quickly, about some of the things you've done before Simulmedia. Quickly, what is Simulmedia, and where do you see data on the internet right now? What are the big issues that you think we should talk about here?
So my background, very quickly, my internet experience started about 1990, 1991, when I was working in the newspaper industry and trying to find new media, sort of information superhighway-oriented businesses. I then started one of the first ad-serving ad network companies called Real Media, which was a predecessor to 24/7 Real Media, now part of WPP. And then I started a company called Dakota, which was one of the pioneers in behavioral targeting, where leveraging the tracking cookies would basically be able to try to deliver more relevant ads. And in Simulmedia, which I've started just over a year ago, we're now leveraging set-top box data from television viewing to try to deliver more relevant advertising in TV. And so as I look back, even starting in 1995, with the ad server, we were already giving dynamic ads depending on what information we could determine was available from the browser. So the idea of trying to deliver one-to-one. I think now, after 15 years of sort of trying to target ads, the areas where I sort of look at from a data standpoint, and I don't want to trivialize technology, but I no longer see big technology barriers to leveraging data. The costs of being, at Dakota we brought in maybe 28 billion data points a day. The cost of being able to do that in real time and take advantage of it, that's not a problem anymore. The costs of storing it are not a problem. The costs of having technology to better understand it are not a problem. I think a lot of the issues now have really moved into the business side and the policy side, which is why the head of engineering spent a lot of time talking about privacy here this morning. And I think it's now, what do we do with the data? How do other people feel about what we do with the data? How do we exploit it? As I say, it's not trivializing the technical parts, because those things are hard. But it's nice that actually we're now getting into the real human application layer.
Yeah, we'll get back to some of the implications of that, too. Philipp, since you are really manipulating data in a big way in your company right now. You're not?
No, we don't manipulate at all.
Well, okay, you don't manipulate it, but you're viewing it and analyzing it and trying to understand it. Talk about what you're doing, and throw the China piece in there, too, when you're explaining that, if you would.
Okay, we're one of those players that never become visible to the outside, end-user game. We are an infrastructure player that actually runs services for big advertising networks to help refine the data points that they actually track for a user, or actually for the page, and relate that to advertising targeting. So that means concretely that, for an advertising network, we might actually take a look at the content of a page, and in a positive way, we relate that to the targeting methodologies that they have internally within the network. At the same time, we make sure that it's a brand-safe environment, that an advertiser wants to advertise against it, so actually avoiding sort of porn content, or even a page changing into something offensive in the comment section. And the second big service is actually using all those content touch points that a network has been tracking for a user, and aggregating that and making statements about what is the sort of the aspects or of interest that a user actually would like to be advertised against. So in contrast to what you're saying, we're not manipulating data, we're actually only refining it, we're packaging it, we're making it accessible for the advertiser.
That could technically be termed manipulation. Go on.
Well, overall, I think that it's an important issue. What you're saying that the level of what you're doing there is something that you have to become aware of. But honestly, I'm not making the choices as a company what to collect. That's my customers doing that. We do have own ethical standards of what we would like to see our technology be used against. But overall, I think that as long as it's anonymous, and which in our case is, we don't track anything called demographics or income or a specific name. So it is something just that it follows the principle. Tell me what your friends are, and I'll tell you who you are. So what you read about, and then I'll tell the network actually what is the choice that a user does to spend time with, and that is something I guess that that is very highly valuable in determining what is advertisement that goes against that.
So you do things like you correlate what someone says on MySpace with what they say on Facebook? Is that the kind of thing you do?
Oh, no. I mean, within the network. So again, our clients are networks that span different websites.
If it was a network that was working with you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we don't do cross-network kind of aggregation like many other data sellers do. We don't, take network data from here and there and then, sell it to there, which, is something that the users don't know. And, it's something that you have to sort of, see in a questionable context.
What is the secret sauce, though, of what you do? What is it you're doing uniquely that others aren't doing?
So we came up with a search technology that is totally language independent, which, follows just pattern recognition and a very, very dynamic way of actually categorizing very deeply. So the benefit mainly of that is that we don't have an explicit training set of sort of semantics that we have to catch up every new development of the language, but it's something that self-maintains. So that was the reason why we could actually go to China and actually do very decent things there. Because I don't speak Chinese, none of our team actually speaks Chinese, but still the applications were done the same way in Chinese as they were in English. So
yeah, and you have a whole operation in Beijing, and two of your biggest customers are Baidu and Taobao, which I find fascinating. I don't know what it means, but do they let you do things with data that you can't do here?
Oh, most certainly, and
like what? like, for example.
Well. One piece is that, and it's not that China just because...
I mean here, in the Western world, in the civil, whatever. Go on.
Go on?
No, yeah, you go
on. So one of the things that we do there that we would never do in the US is actually a result of a problem that is in the market itself and is specific to China. Most Chinese users actually surf the web from internet cafes, which means that the cookie tracking that was done or invented years ago produces a very low quality set of data because you don't know how many users a cookie was associated with. So we've actually aggregated across Renren, which is the Facebook of China, and Yes, one of our partners that has sort of a 75% cookie coverage across China, and sort of made those streams of data assignable to a certain user that we identify through Renren. But that is the only piece of aggregation and sharing that we actually ever did. So in contrast to maybe the difficulties that Google and its likes had in China, we don't have access to person information. We don't have access to identify a person being a specific person, and we don't actually track that or make that available to anyone.
By the way, Renren is probably the biggest worldwide of the Facebook clone companies that was very explicitly modeled after Facebook. It was originally called Xiaonei, which meant student. And now Renren means everybody, I think, or something like that, because they realized that they shouldn't be just... If they're going to copy these guys, they're not just students, then we got to copy the new thing they're going to be, which is for everybody. Oh, shit. Anyway, so Magid, Comscore is a huge data company in a lot of ways, and I know you have a particular point of view about the kinds of things that are possible with targeting using data. Just give your point of view on what you've heard so far up here, and how do you think we should be thinking about the opportunities that data presents us as this huge amount of data is being created every day on the internet?
Well, first of all, people know Comscore as a company that measures traffic, and yes, we do that. People pay a lot of attention to it, but fundamentally, we are about taking a group of people that have opted into sharing the information with us and do a lot of analysis on who they are and what their behavior is. And then we use that to help companies either build their audience by understanding what people's interests are, or monetize their audience by being able to plan for advertising, or by being able to evaluate whether advertising actually delivered the results that people hoped for. So one of the things that was sort of the hallmark and the early promise of the internet is that you know a lot about the user. And that is true to some extent, but it's also not true to a large extent. If you are Facebook, you actually know a lot about the users because their content tells you, or what they post tells you a lot more about that. But your average website really doesn't know a whole lot about the user. They don't really see a person. They don't have a name and address. They see a cookie. And cookie is a machine, is a browser. It's typically anonymous. And as a result, you don't know a whole lot about it. So some people go and aggregate across multiple websites, and they try to glean information about what that user is.
Like what he does.
Like what he does. I think probably the company...
My customers do.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, ad networks do that, which are his customers. But probably the company that has the deepest data set on that is Google, because they have so many touch points with users. But in any case, even if you have this level of information about the user, we all have to understand that it is imperfect data. It just tells you likelihood that somebody is like this or somebody has these kind of demographics, but you never know for sure. Even, let's say, on Facebook, you can tell the gender pretty well from the picture of the person, usually, but you can't necessarily tell the age. So some people, for instance, lie about their age. They want to be over 18 or they want to be over 13 to be able to access certain content. And in fact, very interesting, you can compare what the same person is doing, and we know that in our panel because we can track people across networks. What people say they are on Facebook is different than what they say on MySpace or what they say on YouTube or in other places.
These are people who have opted into your panels, who have
Correct.
agreed to let you pay a more close attention to what they're doing, right?
Right.
So that's
Right.
different, very different, because they've voluntarily agreed. Okay, go on.
Yeah, but by the way, I mean, on privacy, we take privacy very seriously because, fundamentally, there is a trust factor here that these people have trusted us with this information, and as a result, we don't do anything with it other than just analyze the data to be able to provide insights about groups of consumers. So I think what the industry has done and has taken this notion that you know a lot about the users on the internet to extremes. So people now are basically saying, oh, I can guarantee that I can deliver, let's say, males 18 to 34 for you, okay? Advertisers buy this kind of data, and in reality, no one really knows for sure about 100% of the users that they are 18 to 34. All you can hope for is that you are actually improving the targetability of those users, and maybe instead of just having a random ad that runs in a totally untargeted fashion, now you can reach people with 2 times the likelihood or 3 times the likelihood that those people are of that particular subject or that particular characteristic, but you never know for sure.
What I once heard a statistic was that as much as 35% of gender targeting, it's pretty binary, right, is wrong. Is that possibly correct?
Well, it depends on where you get your gender data from. So if you're Facebook, your gender data is very accurate. If, let's say, you get your data from email registration, some data is accurate, some is not. Then a lot of people try to do it from interest. So I have seen somebody that went to a particular site. That site tends to cater to females. But that, in and by itself, doesn't really predict who the user really is. We have done some modeling exercises where we look at the entire visitation that somebody did in a month. So that's sort of 100% perfect information because
every website they visited.
Every website they visited. And we try to predict the gender from that. And you can do that on about 60% of the users. You can do it with 80% accuracy. And the remaining 40%, you can't tell much about it.
So the 35% figure could very easily be correct, or it could even be higher. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay. Start thinking about what you guys want to ask these people, because we'll talk a little more up here, then we'll go to hear some of your thoughts and questions. So Todd, Bitly, is a company that was founded to sort of do something that had already been done by other companies, but with a much more data-centric approach. So talk about what your whole idea was in creating it.
Sure. So about almost 2 years ago at this point, a little more than a year and a half ago, we made a couple of observations about changes in the way content was distributed online. The first of those was decentralization. Traditionally, most content consumption was driven by large search engines, traditional publishers, individuals' homepages, and people were kind of driven in a hierarchical means to content consumption. Obviously, that started to change via, people started sharing links far more through means like Facebook, Twitter, IM, email, instant message networks, message boards, et cetera, et cetera. So content discovery and consumption changed. The other main factor was a reduction in latency. Whereas previous generations of media consumers and even early internet users were used to waiting for content to reach authoritative sources, conventional media sources. Now you have memes that spread in minutes, if not seconds, across the internet based on user social graph and social groups. So we realized that there was essentially another class of users, or another class of individuals adding value to the ecosystem. It wasn't simply the content creators, but it was the content distributors.
Yeah, like a new kind of editor kind of thing, yeah.
Exactly. So until now, it hadn't really been possible for those distributors to be able to analyze and get a gauge on the value they were adding to the ecosystem. So with Bitly, the fundamental early decision was made to open up the metric system, the analytic system. All link data is public on individual links. Anybody can go and create a link, wrap it, rebroadcast something that was created by themselves or by somebody else, and in real time view those results.
I'm curious, how many people here have used Bitly? Well over half. I mean, it's amazing how quickly you've become really central part of the infrastructure, I have to say, so congratulations on that. But you also have a lot of data that you kind of get in the aggregate sense that you probably have the ability to do things with in an interesting way. I mean, how do you think about that?
Sure, we do. Certainly, as we've grown to a certain volume, there are a lot of aggregate trends that can be gleaned. I'm sure much like Facebook has a handle on what people are actively doing, what links they're sharing, what stories are trending, and we can do that in real time with our analytics engine. A very minor example, a month ago for the holiday season, we pushed out a little labs project called Bitly TV, where we curate trending videos that are being shared around the web in real time. Certainly that can be extended to other areas, and you wind up with a system where content isn't necessarily pushed to you from, again, traditional sources, but eventually your social graph will inform the content that you connect with in real time.
Cool. Anybody have thoughts or comments on anything other panelists have said? I don't want to, conversation is good. I want to get to the audience. We've got a lot of people up here, but no? Okay. No burning desires, so to speak. Go ahead.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the debate about privacy. And it was very interesting, the discussion about Facebook and what users choose to release and not release. And I think that there is certainly a phenomenon out there, which is that if people have to take an action, they usually don't do it. So there is, for instance, a huge difference between an opt-in or an opt-out.
Yeah, defaults tend to prevail, right?
Defaults tend to prevail, and so it's very, very important what that default is. Typically, changing the default is an opt-out mechanism. Actually going and intentionally changing it is an opt-in mechanism, and usually those numbers are in the low single digits or the low teens. What I think is a growing issue with privacy is that users have no control about not only the information that they share, but the information that is written about them. So, as an example, I could write an article that can trash Dave, okay? That article is all over the web in search indexes. Dave has absolutely no control over it. And in fact, will have no control over it for the rest of his life. It used to be that there are a notion of a retention limit to something. There is no such a thing as a retention limit. And as a result...
For information.
For information. Yeah. The web just totally destroys that. And I think that that's really a big issue. And it very much pertains to privacy because, number one, if I wrote a trash article about Dave, Dave is not always going to be there to defend himself when somebody's reading it 10 years from now. Number two is that my privacy preferences, even on what I share, are going to change. So, for instance, right now, if I am on a spring break, I don't mind necessarily sharing with my friends pictures on what I did on spring break. On the other hand, do I really want that information 10 years from now? But I've lost control over it.
So I want to address one thing, which is, because I think what you're touching on there is revocability, and it's something I mentioned before. And I think it's something that's interesting about Facebook versus other mediums for this, where you can delete posts. If you upload an embarrassing photo of me and tag me in it, I get a notification, so I don't have to go searching for it and say, like, you've been tagged in a photo. I get the option to remove myself from that photo and get untagged.
No, you can't remove yourself from the photo.
Well, I can't,
you can remove
not
the
physically.
tag from the photo.
I remove the tag, but I make it a lot...
People wish they could remove themselves from
It
the
removes
photo.
it from my profile. Makes me not searchable, yes. We don't have the magic marker yet, or I can just,
No, your
over the
ethical
face.
view is the photographer owns the photo, and that's the way it is going to be, as I understand.
Well, I think that's the worldview.
Yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily ours.
on,
I can't go to your camera and delete your photos.
No, you can't. That's true.
So and then same thing with posts. Again, if I post something, I can delete it. And we recently integrated with a couple search engines for even if I do a public status update, it gets can get indexed by the search engine. And part of that deal was, again, revocability. Is that if the user deletes that, it actually gets pulled out of the index from the search engine, so it's not exposed there either. And this is a tough problem worldwide. And of course, you're mentioning if a third party writes content about someone.
Yeah, and I think certainly any one service has the capacity to be able to manage the data inside their service and try to remove it. But what it comes down to is, you can't change a fact on the ground that happened. I mean, was I here today? One service may be able to take one photo, but you can't change the fact that the amount of facts that essentially can be captured, stored, and collected by others, and out of your control forever, and then ultimately reshaped in ways you might not like, you can't change that. And it's interesting, I was just testifying in front of a U.S. Federal Trade Commission event late last year, and they talked about the challenges the U.S. Supreme Court had when the first cameras came out. And they talked a lot about the privacy, this idea that a camera can capture something and then you can never change your control over it, and how challenging it was to deal with. And we see this right now in France. There's a real talk about recreating your reputation. I mean, why shouldn't someone be able to recreate reputation, going forward in the future? And I think that's the big issue. I mean, what's happening in marketing online is actually much more, it's innocuous compared to what's always happened in direct marketing and the tying together of data. But that doesn't matter because people never understood with any kind of immediacy or transparency how much of their data existed it was being shared. And I think that's actually what's happening is it's less that people are trying to come to grips with what information should we store. It's this whole notion that you can't control your reputation very well. It's out of your control, and it's not very comfortable for most people.
You know what comes to mind in hearing this discussion is Wikipedia, because it has a different model, which is kind of that there ought to be a neutral repository of accurate information, which is under the control of everybody. So that article about Dave that you mentioned, Magid, even if it might be referred to in Wikipedia, David could protest that it was an inaccurate portrayal and make sure that the ultimate article did not reflect primarily the message of that article. Then I wonder if maybe that model, maybe Wikipedia is actually a model for more than an online encyclopedia. It might have more implications in a sense.
It's like better curating. In other words, you can't remove all things that may be out there, but you can go to those places where there are primary curators, which can be a Facebook and can be others, and ultimately be able to give them more credibility or a higher rank.
So I think the other part of this is the importance of self-expression. So if I let you define what the world thinks about me, I may or may not like the outcome, right? But if I have some say, in what the world views in me, which is self-expression, posting, everything from the mundane photos of, me at a soccer game to my musings on, the 3D TVs at CES, right? It gives people a picture of who I am. That self-expression in photography and written form, and expression of other people that I care about, who may write on my wall, who may, include me in a mention in a post. So I think that that's, a balanced view of what people are, and that's why I keep coming back to giving people the chance to have a better determination of what their view is. At least, I can't remove that photo or that article written from the corpus of the world knowledge, but I can balance its view with another set of data that I think a reasoned person looking at would make a different judgment than if that was the only singular thing in the world that you could find about me was something,
I think
unpleasant.
The thing that David said is that within any single system, you can exercise those controls, but when you look at it in the context of the entire web, it's very, very difficult, and I'm not sure it's technologically possible.
So you don't see any solution for that ever emerging, Magid?
I can't see how it's done. So, for instance, if somebody's on Facebook and they have an embarrassing picture, even though you can remove it on Facebook, I am a friend. I could take that picture. I could do a paste copy, and then I could put it somewhere else outside of Facebook, and the user has absolutely no control.
Sure, it happens all the time.
In sovereignty issues, just talk about what you can do in China that you can't do elsewhere. Because if there's any value to the information, and since the incremental cost of capture and storage of a data point is essentially zero, if there's any incremental value, you'll capture it, and you can always go to some sovereignty where you could keep it, where you'll never have an issue. So even if you decided to make perfect laws and perfect technology, so yeah, any bit of data created now will never be fully destroyed.
So I think there is one nuance here. I'm sorry, is the difference between existence and discoverability. So you can't destroy that piece of data from existing in the planet. But for example, again, if the Google search on your name, the first result is this thing that you don't like, then a lot of people are going to use that as their first impression of you. If it's, however, on the 10th search page and the first result, is your Facebook page or your own blog or something else that is a form of self-expression,
it's under your control.
Then yes, that thing does exist in the world, but it's not likely the first thing people see about you. And so that's why I think that it is a tough problem. But I think one of the key things is for people to take control over their own expression and make sure that that's primacy, that's prime, rather than...
The problem is overall that we're sort of in a phase of digital adolescence. Everyone sort of starts to understand what the technology mechanisms and the data implications could have for a person. So the damage that has been done a couple years back now, is suddenly surfacing. The natural reflection or reaction on that is actually to cut everything down. Which is also not doing any good, because it's actually getting rid of a lot of useful mechanisms for which actually the digital infrastructure is built for. Overall, I think there are just counter mechanisms that are surfacing. There's a couple of companies that do reputation management online. So even if you have that situation that Magid was referring to, that if you have sort of content surfacing from within the Google search results about yourself, which you don't really subscribe to, that you can actually build other content areas that actually makes it go down, and then only the results are being seen on the third page, which are eventually never surface at all. So overall, we're just in that phase where people are trying to figure that out. Overall, going forward, transparency and control is actually the mechanism that a user has to become accustomed to, which means that he has to be conscious about what he's doing, certainly know the basics of the mechanisms that that data can have as an effect, and overall be very cautious about how to do it. So Facebook does have a very, very big sort of educational effect on that. They just need to educate their users to say, well, be careful what you do. Parents have to talk with their kids about. Yeah, exactly. Parents have to talk with their kids about sort of how do they act online, how do they interact online, and all these things have to lead to sort of a way that we deal with data that we do in the offline world anyway. So today we really know that Equifax is scoring our credit score, and everything that we do in a financial transaction is being tracked on that. So that's a natural we know that, so we act that way. So online, that has not.
We haven't gotten to that point yet
Exactly.
in online. That's a very good point, Todd.
So I think what Philip mentioned in terms of reputation management is really a prelude to what you're going to get. You're never going to scrub all of the information that you would not like people to see off of the internet. It's going to exist. What you will have likely are better tools to contextualize what you're reading.
Right, which is sort of what he was talking
Right.
about too. Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
to pull in, reputation rankings, sources of authority, counterpoints to content as you browse it, so that you're not just reading something in a vacuum, to the point where you may or may not be available to rebut slander or an inappropriate comment somebody makes about you.
So I want to hear from the audience, but one of the people that I've had the most interesting conversations about data with is sitting in the front row, Andreas Wiegand, who teaches a course in data at Stanford. And I just want to hear anything you've heard that you find particularly interesting or disagree with. There's a mic right behind you. Just quickly, I want to hear your thoughts, Mr. Data.
Thank you. Actually, amazing panel. Thank you for putting that together. Many things I found super interesting. The perspective which I would like to offer here is, to what degree is the company-centric view many of you still have, with the possible exception of Facebook, turning over to a customer-centric view? As some of you might know, I was the chief scientist at Amazon.com, and there we truly have a customer-centric view. So, for instance, when I talked to the head of Reuters New Media last year at Cat Global, and the notion of just taking a picture of somebody and publishing it is really weird to him. 2 days ago at Tegel, I tried to record a conversation I had with a Lufthansa agent because I couldn't believe that they were telling me. And they said, "We have the right to not talk to you now." I said, "You just told me that the ticket is not valid. So what do you mean you have the right for privacy here? This is a business transaction." So what I'm interested in is what I call the social data revolution, how people's attitude towards the data they create is actually changing. What do they expect from companies in return? So many of you have the perspective, what can companies do in terms of targeting, but what can individuals do in terms of expectations?
Good. Very interesting point of view. Dave.
I think that the first thing is, and the word targeting already presupposes it, which is targeting is about how the company is going to exploit and hit different people, which is quite different than delighting you. And I think that companies have to reshape what they do around a absolutely explicit, clear, transparent, and high-value exchange to the consumer, to the user, so that the person, and I like to, in our company, I like to use the word delight. So it's like we use data to delight. And if it's not delighting, then it hasn't hit a certain level. It's not like it's infinitesimally better, and we try never to use the word targeting.
In other words, what you're trying to do with data in the set-top box is to give the consumer something that's more satisfactory and usable for them.
Yeah. I want people to be delighted by television and overall. And we're only going to know that we're successful if we actually see them taking actions that actually show that we've been successful. And so we're tracking against that, not trying to deliver women 35 to 42 with certain income purchases. We'll never segment people and deliver like that, because that's about what the marketer wants. I believe you have to focus on what the user wants, and so that's why I like this word delight.
Thank you, Steph. That's very pertinent to something that gets said all the time, which is that the internet or various companies say, they're heading toward a point where the advertisement is seen as content that the user actually wants, which always sounds very implausible, but it potentially might be possible.
I mean, if you think of, for anyone here who uses Facebook and look at this now, it's not the traditional banner ad on the top or anything like that. The ads are actually fairly well integrated into the overall product, and we've actually seen most success with our ad units that look like content in the sense of, I get a video on my homepage of a movie coming out this week, and I can watch the movie and then I can send it to my friends and say, hey, I'm going to check out, Up or Up in the Air. And those ads perform extraordinarily well because they act like content on the rest of the site. And it's a suggestion. It's like, we notice that you may enjoy this movie and like to see it. And so I think that we're seeing that integration, rather than this thing that I have to wait for to get to the stuff I really want, which is what a lot of content,
the pop-up,
the banner, the thing that I get used to ignoring. It's actually a piece of content that when you get very, very good at helping understand what people want, it really improves the experience. Whether it be a better newsfeed story or, hey, I actually didn't know about that movie and great, let me send it to my friends.
Philipp.
Actually, there are a lot of trends in the industry that actually make us be forced to be user-centric. I mean, one thing is actually performance, which means ad performance. In effect, only the relevance of an advertising and the receptiveness of the user to engage in that advertising speaks for itself, because the user actually values to actually become engaged. And it's very different from proactive email marketing that actually spams users' inboxes, or the pop-ups that are very annoying that you sort of being forced to look at. So in a way, that's happening already. Overall, I would say that that actually the degree of relevance is something that users really value. You can just take the AdWords program on Google just as the best result. So if you just hacking something as an intention, a search query, and you have phenomenal conversion rates of up to 25%, that is something where the user actually tells a big story. This is something I want to see, and they go to the search engine even to see advertising results, not only organic results in the search results page.
Great. Question back there. And by the way, my timer went off, so I have no idea how much time we have.
Just a transition, picking up from Andreas's point, great panel, I agree there, Craig Foreman. Suggest everyone take a look at the Boston Globe a couple of weeks ago. The city of Boston held a person briefly because they took a cell phone picture of the city of Boston stopping a person who was suspected of stealing a car. There's a law in Boston, or a rule, that allows the police to briefly detain you because taking that picture impedes their investigation. If the police officer alleges that you're impeding an investigation by taking a picture or becoming a so-called an observer who takes a permanent record, that can be a target of a police action. I think that's an interesting thing, picking up on the point you made earlier. The question is, I've been thinking a lot about how your panel would relate to, I think, another big thing in data, which is mobile location and your location grid. We've talked a lot about tagging, we've talked about photos. Let's talk about the next phase of location-based advertising, which offers the allure of tremendously higher CPMs based on where you happen to be. But what about that data remaining something that should stay in or off the grid? Who are you, by the way? Craig Foreman, Success Television investor and board member of ULocate.
Okay, cool. So any thoughts on this location-based thing? Because clearly it's a whole new universe of data about us that is becoming available. Who wants to say something about that?
As mentioned before, it's about as personal as you can get.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it before, and I think that, again, this is, the more personal it gets, the more key it is that the people get to opt into what's there. So I think you're seeing two kinds, it's a very emerging area, two kinds of products. One that just kind of just publishes my location as I go around, and I effectively have to opt out, and another which I think is becoming much more popular, which I use myself, which is, I want to publish my location, so the check-in phenomenon. It's like, hey, I'm at this restaurant, and I'm in a mode where if I bumped into a friend, that would be great, as opposed to I'm in a business meeting and I don't want to be interrupted, so like knowing my location is not actually useful to people. So I think that, starting with a sense of very explicit control over where the location is seems to be where the market is going.
So I want to put it in context of what you know about people on the web. The location-based thing is actually tied to a phone number, and it eventually tied to an individual person that you know something about. You actually know with certainty that that's the person. On the web, when you are doing it with a cookie, it's nowhere near as sensitive. So when you look at it again from the standpoint of a business result or advertising, it's going to be very effective. But from the standpoint of privacy, it is obviously very sensitive. And I think that somehow we need to figure out a notion of retention limits so that this stuff gets purged in a short period of time. Otherwise, there are a lot of bad implications to it.
I'll answer the question from two perspectives. One, obviously, from the advertiser's perspective, which honestly, the technology challenge that is sort of associated with doing the matching over another dimension called location, which is sort of very, very granular, brings out a lot of difficulties in scalability, but more importantly, actually, the perspective of advertising scarcity. So one of the biggest problems in advertising is actually that you don't have enough campaigns or enough advertising dollars to go against what you could potentially actually target against, and then actually to find the most adequate audience. So everyone's trying to, find that left-handed, yellow-haired grandmother that plays the guitar on California Avenue in Palo Alto, which ultimately is never going to be there. They're going to just be one, if not no one. So, the biggest difficulty is the blend of everything in that context. and bringing enough advertising dollars to be effective against it. The second comment is actually more the usability comment. There's a dangerous game that you become too aggressive in actually bringing out the advertising message. So mobile is going to be much more sensitive towards actually how do you interact with users and what is the degree of engagement that you can actually ask a user to do. And there's more the game-like interactions like Foursquare is doing that are sort of more decent about it. But I think there's going to be a very, very fine line that advertisers and companies have to do in mobile advertising to become really effective. I know eCPMs are high just for the matter of the fact that they're hyper-targeted, but the overall ecosystem is very small compared to everything else still.
J.P. Rangaswamy of BT.
I want to riff on something that Andreas brought up about the switch to customer-centric data. We're living in an age where metadata is cheaply collected and live streaming is common. People are really building habits that say, how many times has this photo I've uploaded been seen by somebody, who's read my LinkedIn profile, what kind of people, who's retweeted my tweet. So data about the data and its movement is becoming more and more important. If you take somebody like Facebook with your 3.5 billion pieces of data every day, you start actually saying who liked this as individuals. So now suddenly data is associated with names of people liking things, okay? Which creates a really interesting privacy challenge, because now as we wander through our lives, there is a movement that says we will actually know who did it. Who read my blog, who read my tweet, who picked up my photograph, rather than just the numerical count. We're seeing some trends that it's actually explicit counts of the humans involved. As soon as you know exactly who it is and information becomes symmetric, a lot of the issues of privacy disappear. The problems of privacy emanate from not knowing who is this big brother that's watching you, and is that access asymmetric? What do you guys think about that?
I think I would add one point to it, which is it's not just the who, which obviously means a lot from a personal social, but if we look historically, the really big issue has been the governments. And if you look at sort of the sensitivity people have around data, the area where it just goes off the charts with their negative reaction is when you start seeing a lot of this information used and managed by governments in how they, governments and sometimes other businesses. But I think I think it's an amazing.
Well, that's the way Americans tend to think. The Europeans tend to get more worried about it being used by businesses.
Well, until governments abuse it. I mean,
Well, which they seem to occasionally do, right? Unfortunately, we're very close to be out of time, but let's hear really quickly from you. Identify yourself, and we may just make it a comment, if we can, then a question. Go ahead.
I'm Brad Templeton, chairman of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a privacy rights foundation, among other things.
Glad we got to you then.
I guess I won't try and make too many points, but because this kind of rankles, I said I would like the panel to be challenged a little bit about what the actual value of all the data collection infrastructure they want to build is. And I'm going to say in a somewhat sardonic way, it's a trivial number of billions compared to the potential social consequences of the things. And I'm glad that many of you are aware of them, but what people are not aware of, and I get to worry about, is the threat of robots from the future. Now, the reason there's a threat of robots in the future, I'm not referring to the governor of California, is that AI technology is going to get better as time goes on. AI technology today can't do face recognition very well. It can't do speaker recognition very well. It can't be asked questions like, would you find me the most embarrassing thing about this person, rather than the first Google hit, the most significant. Yeah. It can't answer those questions today. Everyone agrees it will answer those questions in the future on the data that's collected. So it's very, very difficult, and I hope that we can come up with more compelling use cases than throwing sheep at our friends and being given a Starbucks coupon when we're walking by a Starbucks in exchange for what's going to happen with those time-traveling robots from the future.
This really, so many of that's fascinating. Thank you for that. This issue of the arms race that I was talking about with Facebook is really just true in a more broad sense, that data about individuals is just exponentially growing, and individuals, as Philipp said and others, just don't understand what's being gathered about them or what to do about it. And so you have this simultaneous educational process that has to happen of the individuals of how to manage their data. Facebook, in effect, is trying to create more a universe where they have more control in hopes that more of the stuff's going to actually flow through there so they get that control. And that is part of the Facebook's vision, by the way, that more of all this stuff will flow through Facebook and therefore be more under the control of the individual. I think that's a fair point, isn't it? But yet it's happening everywhere. It's happening everywhere, and this thing about the future is really a great element to overlay.
First of all, I fully subscribe to what you're saying, that the sort of the long-term applicability of whatever is being stored is has to be taken into account. I can soothe your mind that actually in terms of my personal business, actually the sort of tracking user intent over 6 to 8 weeks is sufficient. So we actually don't keep data beyond that. And I think that's the most overlooked mechanism within advertising targeting that actually people are not subscribing to. There are a lot of companies, including the big Google, that are tracking everything for the for the time being and just keeping everything for the hope that actually down the road some correlation might have an effect. I think
it also make it easier for the Chinese to hack into their systems and pull the data out.
Well, that was based on sort of the spyware infrastructure that they were running anyway, so that's a different story. But overall, I would say that the main point is that actually customers become aware what the explicit data and the sort of the real world data that relates them to the person is actually how that's being tracked and being sort of used across the web. I worry more about services like Blippi that sort of where users open up all their sort of financial transactions to the world and hope to have a social connection in a Starbucks based on that, more than actually the implicit kind of targeting that people like us are working on, which are sort of non-related to a person per se. So I understand where you're coming from, but overall, I think we are a self-regulated industry, and we might be regulated at a certain point in time. And one of the measures that's going to be looked at is actually how long do we store data, and how is that going to be accessible in a couple of years' time.
Okay, closing thoughts. Anybody have anything they want to say before we finish up?
Well, I think the two key issues are, can you identify the user, identifiability of the user, and then second, how long are you able to keep that information about the user, so 5 years from now a robot is not going to find out information about me. And I think that the focus ought to be on anything that actually eventually traced down to an individual has to have some degree of control by the user. Otherwise you create a time bomb that will become a major issue 5 or 10 years down the road.
Fascinating. Dave?
I think all of this brings up a need to look at a new class of information and knowledge workers in our industry. Because we've always been built on people that are very good in zeros and ones and bits, and everything is black and white. And we're dealing with a big world of gray, and I think it's really critical. Our companies are bringing in people with strong liberal arts grounding in history and anthropology. Ethics, because we have to be thinking about these things, not just what's possible, but what's right.
Yeah, very good closing point. So thank you all. I think it shows there's a lot to discuss in this area. Good discussion. Thank you all.